Hi, my name is Paul Seligson, and I'm delighted to be here with you. Sadly, I'm in Brighton, England, while all of you are in wonderful Latin America. How I wish I was there with you. Nevertheless, let's get on with the talk. My talk is entitled, Are We Holding Back Latino Learners? And obviously, I believe that we are, and I hope by the end of this talk that you share that belief. Just to begin with, we're going to have two quick activities. First one, can you think of two items of clothing beginning with the same letter in English and your own language? Throughout this presentation on the screen, you'll see L1, by which I mean your own or your first language. In your case, I imagine it's Spanish or Portuguese, but much of what I'm going to say applies to any Romance language. Okay, so for example, you might say bikini, and if you look at the images there of famous Latinos, you'll get lots of ideas. I'll come back to that one. That's the first task. The second task, what is your policy on use of first language when teaching Latinos in our typical monolingual classes right across Latin America? What I invite you to do is to try and make a note of it, because it's very healthy, I think, to, in a nutshell, reduce yourself down. What is your policy? Is it last resort? Is it as and when? Is it all the time? Whatever you think. And in about 10 minutes time, I'll share my policy with you. Perhaps you could write it down, and then at the end of the session, when we have time for questions, we could look at some options in the chat box. Okay, so that's two activities for you to be getting on with. I'll get on with the talk. So my title is, Are We Holding Back Latino Learners? And let's begin with where we are now. The learning goal for our students and globally, I think now, is no longer, thankfully, near native competence, which is largely unrealistic in most cases, but instead to become an effective interactive communicator in internationally intelligible English as a lingua franca. I think you would agree with that. Second point is, I don't think it's controversial, but it's my belief, Romance language speakers should achieve this faster, I would say much faster than most other learners, because of the rich common ground between Portuguese and Spanish and English. So let's have a look at what that common ground is. Spanish and Portuguese are two of the 10 closest languages to English. So obviously, if they are your own language, your first language, you're in a much better position than somebody with a far more exotic first language, because of they're so much closer. 58% of English comes from Latin, just like Spanish and Portuguese. So you've got a huge lexical advantage. 1 in 3, 1,000 of the 3,000 most common words are cognates. If you don't believe me, you can actually count them. Honestly, I have, and it comes out approximately 1 in 3 of the most common words are cognates. And fewer than 6% of cognates are false. For years, we've been obsessed with false cognates. If you Google cognate, even Google itself is obsessed with false cognates. The first thing which comes up most of the time is false cognates, which is a tiny proportion of the cognates. 94% of cognates are true friends, and we should celebrate them and not worry anything like as much about the 6% of cognates which are false. It's actually fewer than that. When you look in context, you can often guess what they might mean if you're unsure. So really, it's a very small fraction. 94% we should be celebrating. It's relatively easy for our students to accelerate their vocabulary acquisition because so much of it is familiar and recognizable, as compared to a Russian student, a Chinese student, for example, a Turkish student, who have far greater difficulty in acquiring many of the words which are, for our students, basically a Merry Christmas, a present. Which should lead to greater fluency earlier, I would say much earlier. And of course, from fluency, you develop confidence. The key to fluency often is vocabulary anyway, and our students have this huge lexical advantage. And of course, most English sounds exist in our students' mother tongues. There are many, many grammatical similarities. Sure, there are more differences than similarities, but there's still a lot of grammatical similarities as compared, for example, to Indonesian or to Arabic or to the more exotic languages. So our students should, if language learning were a race, be at the front of the race rather than perhaps in the middle or at the back. However, by failing to exploit these significant advantages, I would argue that we're delaying and we're diminishing their communicative potential. And that, unfortunately, has been the case in my decades of traveling around Latin America. The students are not at the front of the race. They're not learning more quickly than other students. If anything, they're sort of on a par and sometimes behind, because the methods that we've been using don't play to these significant advantages. We've moved on, thankfully, too, from monolingual teaching. I mean, the idea of only English, through English, I have a gun, if you speak the mother tongue, I will shoot type of thing, is frankly absurd if you think about it, because you can't switch off the mother tongue. It's permanently there. And so students are forever moving between languages. Language teaching, as Woodison said, has always been a bilingual process. And now, globally, thankfully, there's a huge acceptance that it's a bilingual process. And translanguaging is very much accepted, and it's run-of-the-mill now, in fact. By translanguaging, we mean using all one's language resources to achieve communicative, sometimes it's difficult to say that, communicative goals. Okay, so bringing in Spanish, Portuguese, and everything you might know from other languages, as well as the English that you've got, to get your meaning across. My favorite definition is this by Garcia and Li Wei. It's going beyond our standard separation of languages and working things out with, between, and through the two languages. In other words, L1 based second language learning. And that's really what I'm going to be promoting throughout this talk. Our teaching should be Spanish or Portuguese based English learning. Rather than simply giving a general international type approach, we should, I think, tailor and be much more specific to our students' starting point, which is their first language. This is pretty obvious, isn't it? Latinos can express so much more from day one if, and it's a big if we choose the right language. Let me give you an example. I like to do this on day one with my students, right at the beginning, rather than just drilling through the verb to be, what's your name, where are you from, etc., which we have to do, of course. A lot of students overdo this. I think we can jump in with something a bit more interesting, sharing opinions. So I put on the board, I think Bad Bunny, he, Fernando Torres, she, artificial intelligence, it, and empanadas, they, is or are, plus adjective. And then I give my students 14 adjectives in two groups. They're positive and negative. And I say, okay, share your opinions. And they can say, what's your opinion of Bad Bunny? I think he's fantastic. I think he's marvelous. I think he's horrible. I think he's whatever. Okay, and they can start to distinguish each other and can learn about each other through English from day one. Obviously, they may say, horrible, horrible. But when you show them the stress, as I have there in blue, the students, through practice, can quickly move the stress to the right place, reduce the E, and emphasize the ho. They may have problems with the H, of course, but through practice, at least they will be intelligible and soon quite good, and hopefully in the end, very good at pronouncing these words. It's through practice that we improve pronunciation. And my argument is throughout our teaching, to develop fluency earlier, we should be adding easy confidence building cognates pretty much whenever they go, the students could say this, they could say this, they could say that. Why not just throw it in, put it on the board, perhaps mark the stress, and make it available to the students? What's the problem behind the current method? The problem, it's too international, it's too generalized, it's one size fits all. And every student is different, every learner is different. A lot of the methods and materials that we're using are based on sort of research of frequency and learner dictionaries and common European framework-based international course books, most of which suggest that only 2 of these words should be taught at A1. So a quick question for you. Which of the 14 adjectives that you can see are the 2 easiest? Which are the 2 A1 adjectives? This is according to the Cambridge Learner Dictionary, for example. And I suspect you'll find it quite difficult to choose which are the easiest, because they're all easy for our students. I'd love to know what you're saying, but anyway, the answer is important and interesting are allegedly the 2 which should be taught at A1. Excellent, fantastic, popular, rich, special, horrible, and terrible are the ones which should be included at A2. The others there, marvelous, stupid, and delicious, are B1 according to these classifications, which I find slightly offensive because I've eaten the best meals of my life in Latin America, but I can't say delicious until B1. That does seem a little absurd. And then, worst of all, ridiculous is supposed to be B2 according to these classifications. Now, clearly, they're not saying don't teach these words, but other words are given priority over these words according to this calculation, this measurement. And to my mind, that you're excluding what is so relatively easy and accessible for our students, and it doesn't really work in their best interests. In fact, I find this slightly ridiculous. And what's interesting is if you look through the different classifications from the different publishers, the different dictionaries and so on, they don't even agree which these words are. But you do get examples. A friend of mine has just been producing materials for an A2 course book. And he was strictly told by the publisher, you can only use A2 words from our corpora, which meant if the corpora was as on the screen there, he wouldn't be allowed to say delicious in the first 2 in an A2 course book. He wouldn't be allowed to say horrible or terrible. It's ridiculous. L1 is not an obstacle, certainly not in our case when our languages are so close to English, but it's a resource, an asset, because we're so close. And we must remember the power of positive transfer. It's so motivating to suddenly be liberated and start being able to use a lot more language than you see on the pages of a book or materials. And if by not doing this, as many of us still do following these internationalist routes, we diminish our students' learning potential. They're not at the front of the race, they're sort of pushed back rather than emerging as front runners. So that's something you can do pretty easily. Own language is the greatest pedagogical resource. Nobody would dispute that. It lays the foundations for all other languages which we might want to learn. For Butzkemen and Caldwell, it's a language acquisition support system. I like thinking of that, a language acquisition support system. It's a wonderful thing to tell your students. Spanish and Portuguese are supporting your learning. And their argument goes on, a structured and principled deployment of the student's own language, as opposed to the chaotic way it tends to appear despite restrictions in monolingual teaching. We've all used Spanish, we've all used Portuguese. You know, sometimes we feel guilty about it, but it's not really principled, it's not organized, it's rarely systematic, and I think it should be. So a structured and principled deployment can increase rather than decrease the use of the new language for communication. So by structuring and principling our use of L1, we can, I think, accelerate our students' learning. Is that explicit throughout your teaching and your training? Do your students have a clear idea of this? Do your colleagues talk about this as a positive thing, or do we see Spanish and Portuguese still as more of a problem than a potential solution? And if we look in the article, the description of plurilingual competence, which is being heavily promoted these days through many bilingual schools and so This is interesting to see what they define it in section 1.3 as involving the ability to use a variety of languages flexibly, switching from one to another, expressing yourself in one language and understanding another, using knowledge of various languages to make sense of a text, recognizing words from a common international store when they're extended in a new form or a new meaning, to mediate between people whose language you don't speak, even if you only have a little knowledge of that language yourself, to bring everything you've got into play when you're trying to express yourself in a new code, and also all the wonderful things you can do with paralinguistics, mime, gesture, etc. I'm so very fond of helping my students to express themselves through body language, as I'm sure you are too. So that's plurilingual competence. Let's look at another example. If the students ask you, profe, ¿cómo se dice tolerar? Or similar in Portuguese. How do you say tolerar in English? Or continuar, or separar, or impedir? What would you give your students? With our Spanish or Portuguese speaking classes, which would you teach first at the levels I'll show you in a second? Would you teach put up with or tolerate? Go on, carry on, or continue? Split up with or separate? Hold back or impede, restrict? At these levels there, which would you teach at A1 if they say, how do you say tolerar? How do you say hold back? How do you say, how do you say separar? Sorry. What would you teach? At A1, which would you go for? Put up with or tolerate? How about A2? And B1, which would you choose? Put up with or tolerate? I look forward to seeing your answers when I watch this video with you later. My answer is A1, tolerate. A2, tolerate. B1, tolerate. Why? Because they can use it immediately. They don't have any problems at all about meaning, very few pronunciation issues, and off they go. How many of your students at A1, A2, or B1 can honestly use put up with, or split up with, or hold back, or go on, or carry on? It strikes me as we're giving the more difficult form because we're still thinking about monolingual nativism, sorry. We're trying to sort of worship at the native temple, and there are all sorts of reasons why you shouldn't do that, but primarily because it's simple and it's usable and they can get on with it straight away, and we don't need to dwell on all the problems which phrasal verbs bring. And if you look, going back to these classifications of word frequency, they're both the same. They're both B2 words. These two are both B1. These two are both B1 too. So you can, according to the criteria which are used elsewhere to discriminate words, you can choose. Do you want to teach split up with or separate? I know which I prefer to teach. Sorry, I'm just getting a message. Oh no, I'm not, sorry. I thought I was getting a message. Hold back or impede. It's interesting. If you look in the Cambridge English vocabulary profile, hold back isn't even there. Neither is impede, only restrict, and that's a C1 word. So my feeling is that if you can possibly avoid phrasal verbs at the earlier levels and give them something they can use straight away, surely they're going to have more confidence, more fluency, and be able to use that language broadly. Okay. Let's have a look at one more question before I go to that. Is if the students ask you, teacher, what does put up with mean? In one word, what would you say? You would say tolerate. So you simplify it for them when they want the meaning. Why not simplify it for them when they want to actually use the words too? And if you were teaching in China, which would you teach? Would you give them put up with or tolerate? And my answer is, I really don't care because we're not teaching in China. We're teaching in Latin America, and our job is to simplify the process and accelerate the process as much as possible for our learners. Okay, so, and then I love that image, the idea of building on existing knowledge, because that's the essence of language teaching. We need to build on what they know. That's why we have levels: level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4. And we also know our learners so well, we can have a context-specific approach, beginning with their existing knowledge. We know they'll understand tolerate, continue, and impede, for example. So here are some options, some easier, more feasible initial options to complex phrasal verbs. I've just brainstormed a few there for you. There are many, many more. Have a look at them. Which is easier and more feasible for our students? Blow up or explode? Bring up or mention? Get across or communicate? Make up for or compensate? Take in or deceive? We know which to understand. We know which they could probably use. And yet, too many of us, for the wrong reasons, we still think, oh, we have to teach the phrasal form first because that's what a native would say. Well, you know, I'm not convinced. I want my students, keep it simple, because your students will get there more quickly. And of course, so much of language learning is confidence-based. If they keep losing confidence because it's too difficult, when we could make it simple, are we really doing the right thing by our students? I'm not sure. And then if you start looking around for cognates, you can find a hell of a lot. Look at all these. For example, I've just circled all the verbs which you can use. I would take a screenshot of that if I was you. All of those verbs, you can give instructions. So I've observed hundreds and hundreds of classes of Romance language learners around the world. That's one of my jobs, to observe and give feedback. And it's a privilege because you learn so much more by observing in many ways than you do by teaching. And often you see teachers struggling with instructions, so they quickly switch into Spanish or Portuguese to give the instructions. And I spend a lot of my time just noting down what they've said and then finding ways to express what they said in their own language using this sort of language. And it's very easy, I think, to get, once you get into the habit of using cognates, you can express an awful lot. Look at all that grammatical terminology as well, all of which is available to our students. If you say it slowly, generate. So the first time, just say it slowly. The second time, say it more quickly, and the students will come with you and they'll comprehend. So I mean, when you start looking for cognates, it's amazing what you can find. Let's go back to the Marco, the Common European Framework. Word level allocation generally has been a combination of word frequency data, which is wonderful, all the beautiful things that corpora bring, and experts matching them to the descriptors in the framework. Again, a wonderful thing. But, there's often a but, it's still a generalization about what is broadly relevant to the average learner. But we're not teaching average learners. We're teaching clearly identifiable, L1 specific, context specific Latinos. And so are we best off working with generalizations, or should we be more specific? And then if we think about it, Latinos learning English is very different from Latinos learning Chinese. Which are they going to learn more quickly? Clearly, Chinese, for all the advantages that we know. And Latinos learning English is very different from Chinese students learning English. Our students can understand and potentially use literally thousands of words without much effort. That does not apply to learners from whose mother tongue is Chinese, for example. So I do think we're holding students back by not being much more specific to what we could do and can do and should do with them a lot more quickly. The labels in the Common European Framework are principled, research-based criteria to inform and guide, but not to dictate vocabulary selection. And as I say, many of these labels would be disputed by different organizations, publishers, dictionaries, and so on. And if you actually look inside the framework itself, it tells us to expand, adapt, and omit according to context, learners' own languages, and local relevance and utility. So it's in the framework. We should be doing this. We should be adapting. We should be changing things according to our specific situation. But all too often, you see students following the same linguistic diet, the same materials diet in Chile and China, in Turkey And up in Mexico or right across the world, we still get these international approaches rather than these L1 specific approaches. Recognizing and adapting differences to context is absolutely essential to successful teaching and learning. I'm sure, again, you would all agree with that, but is it what we're doing on a regular basis? Our goal, remember, is not to create mini native speakers, but effective communicators in internationally intelligible English as a lingua franca, using all their linguistic resources to interact globally. Okay, and we know our students are Latinos. And so a quick question for you, just a little mini quiz. 3 questions. What percentage of English teachers globally are not native speakers? How many English users are there in the world using it as a first, second, third, or foreign language? And how many Romance language users are there in the world as well? I'll just give you a second to think about that, have a guess. Maybe type in your answers into the chat box and we'll see what you're saying. Okay, time's up. So here we go. It's amazing. Somewhere between 90 and 95% of English teachers globally are not native speakers. They're non-native. The only reason we can't be more specific is nobody knows quite how many teachers of English there are in China, for example. How many people use English globally? Well, David Crystal in a broadcast last week said it's about 2.3 billion now. It's not rising as much as it was, but that's about where we are now. So it's over a quarter of the world. But, and this is my point, there are at least 1.5 billion Romance language users, all of whom would understand tolerate more than put up with, all of whom would understand impede more than hold back, for example. So my arguments apply to our students, but also the way the students are going to use English globally. The chances of being understood with a phrasal verb are significantly lower in general than using the Latinate forms, which I've just been looking at, because of the numbers. Look at the numbers. Our students are much more likely to be comprehensible to the world using the more formal, if you like, the more Latinate term than phrasal verbs. I'm not suggesting for a minute we shouldn't teach them. There's a big difference between comprehension and production. But whenever the students ask for a word, when they want to produce it, then surely it's better to give them the one that they can use straight away until, I would say, at least a B1 level. And across Latin America, an awful lot of students don't need to get beyond B1 before they finish college, university, or whatever. So going back to this question, as I said, the best thing you can do when the students ask you those questions is simply respond, guess. Whenever you know that there's a cognate at the end of the rainbow, just say, guess, and they may tolerate, tolerant, good, tolerate, correct, good, teach the rest of the class. The students can find it, and the more they guess, the more they get used to anglicizing words, the better, to my mind. Sometimes they'll be incomprehensible when they hit a non-cognate, for example, but it's still a key life skill. And you see people doing this on your travels around the world, trying to create English. And it's a magical thing. It can foster positive transfer. And when it doesn't work, oh, I tried. It creates a memorable experience and can alert students to significant differences. And it feels great too, the ability to communicate quite complex ideas with a word or two which is similar to your mother tongue is immensely satisfying and motivating. And as I've said before, going back to that lovely image, a principal tenet of cognitive psychology and any teaching method, whether you're teaching yoga or whether you're teaching cookery or whatever, is to build on existing knowledge. That's how we learn. And this is perhaps more controversial, but it's my experience teaching for 40 years plus in Romance language situations. Facility for L1 speakers is often just as important as corpora classification. Okay. All right, on we go. So I promised you this earlier. What is your policy on use of L1 when you're teaching Latinos in monolingual classes? Again, I look forward to seeing your answers. Here's my answer. I work in Pachuca occasionally, and my last teaching experience has been in Mexico, and there I try to be both systematic and explicit about ways to take advantage of Spanish. I use about 95% of English myself. I'm not afraid of Spanish. I use it frequently whenever I feel it can accelerate the process. But in general, I try to be the model to immerse my students, as we all do, I'm sure. I get my students to say all they can in English, obviously, just as we all do. But also, I ask them to make regular reference. I ask them often, just pause. In your head, translate it. Count the words. Notice the order. Think about it. Keep it in your head. You don't need to speak Spanish now. Just do it. Just stop, pause, think. Okay. Boom, boom, boom. Let's carry on. Just that little pause to allow the translation, because prohibiting it doesn't work. We know they're going to do it anyway. It's impossible to stop. So we need to find a way to systematize its use. Obviously, I can get them to pause and tell each other what's just been said in translating into Spanish or whatever. But it's so often you can look around the room when you sweep around the room, you know that not everybody's got it. So quickly just tell each other what's going on, paraphrase, etc. I'll give you an example of that in a second. I try to be systematic about it. I have clear signals when to stop and when to start, and the students know that I'm simply trying to facilitate. It's a fundamental group management tool. And what I tell my students that I'm doing, I'm very open about this. I'm giving you Spanish-specific English teaching and learning. And they say, oh, but teacher, we don't want any Spanish. That's not what the research says. The research says that most students really do appreciate regular reference to the mother tongue, not least because they're doing it anyway. And I think that I'm a better teacher because I know Spanish and Portuguese. I get invited to Turkey a lot for historical reasons, but my Turkish is awful. And I really struggle to give examples when I'm giving presentations in Turkey because I don't know both languages. I don't know both codes. I don't know what my students are thinking. And I do believe that I'm a much better teacher in Latin America than I am, for example, in Germany or Turkey, whose languages I just don't speak. So again, this mythology about native speaker hasn't really helped us, I don't think. Back to task one. Do you remember that task? A long time ago, I gave you a little task about thinking of more items of clothing. Can you think of two more items of clothing which begin with the same letter? Maybe make a note or in the chat box if you can. But also, as you do this, could you notice what's happening inside your coconut? What are you doing to yourself? Are you sort of bouncing words back and forth? Are you like a metronome? It's sort of mental ping pong, looking for equivalence. We'll come back to that at the end of the session. So this again is controversial. How many words is each level? I mean, it's very difficult to find out. If you look at the research, there you are, active A1, for example, active 300, passive 600. Another one here, fewer than 1,500 words. Another one here, going back to the English vocabulary profile, I've actually counted how many words there are in each section. It's 784 A1, etc., etc. You can see the numbers there. Obviously, it's cumulative, and the student. I've tried to average it out by looking at all the sources I found. It seems to be somewhere in the region of 800 or so, 800 to 850 active words at A1. But it's not clear, and there's no agreement about this, I don't think. But to my mind, for Romance speakers, it should be well over 1,000. Which words? Well, I've shown you all those cognates. I would focus on cognates regularly and bringing in cognates because they're all Merry Christmas words. They're easy to comprehend, easy to use. Again, so I think our students should be exposed to at least 25% more words, most of which they can use at the lower levels. Otherwise, as I say, we're holding our students back. Let's have a look at another text. Could you read that text quickly? It's only 100 words. What level would you say this text is? Okay, and if you just put in some answers, we can see the spread during the transmission of this video. What I do with a text like that, in pairs, just read and circle the words you can answer. We'll look at the level issue in a minute. And there you are. They've got all these words which they can find. So I wonder if you think the level is still as high as perhaps you put the first time. Then what I do is I mark the stress. So I ask students to try to pronounce them first. Then I add the stress, which there you are in blue. So I've added the stress, and they can correct each other. Oh, we got that one right, we got that one wrong, etc., etc. Then they can try and say them correctly. And then I do whatever. Teach, read the text, answer the questions, extract the grammar, whatever you're trying to do with that particular text. And then right at the end of the class, just before they leave, I'll have the students, as you leave the class, just before you leave, pronounce them again, and then celebrate how much you can say better now and how much comes from Spanish. You can do this with any text. Just begin with seek the cognates, try to pronounce them, add the pronunciation, do whatever else you were going to do, and then come back at the end of the class. It's a real nice shape for a class. Again, when I've taken the cognates out of that text now, and look, there are only 2 words there which are tricky. Every other word in that text, I think, the students could understand, possibly not jungle, okay. It's interesting when you take the cognates out of a text and you look at what's there, it's very, very simple. That's pretty much a late A1, early A2 text. And when you look at the cognates and you apply them to the, you look in the various classifications, those words are B1, B2, C1, and C2, but they're all available to our students. They're certainly comprehensible. Perhaps they won't know idyllic in their mother tongue, but even so, it's a good learning process to learn the 2. You get 2 things for the price of 1. So my answer is, I would say that text is A2 for Latinos, no more, because of what they can read it, they can comprehend it. With a little help, they can start to use that language. And I would say it's a strong B1 or probably B2 with a multilingual class. If they haven't got that advantage from Latin, that they're going to struggle an awful lot with that text. So again, they're not the typical types of text that you find in international methods or international course books, because they're written for the world. They're not specific enough for our students. So again, we're holding them back by not exposing them to words. So a tip, if you become a materials writer, writing materials for Latin America, don't edit out cognates. That's what happens across the board in international materials. Everything is edited according to the classifications of word level. But what we should be doing for our students, we don't need to edit out the text at all. We should be helping them and giving them the confidence to tackle these words, enjoy these words, and perhaps even use these words. Then this is what I would do. I just threw this in because this is how I teach, and I think it's very useful to have a daily teaching thing. What I would do is ask students to try and remember the 10 cognates from the text. And I do this all the time. Just pause, in pairs paraphrase, in pairs summarize, in pairs check comprehension, in pairs translate back and forth what you've just seen. Ideally in English, but obviously, depending on the level, they can use Spanish too. And this is how I get my students systematically to help each other using the mother tongue, sharing what they've understood. So just a pause, check, then let's get back into English again. That's systematic, and students, in my experience, really enjoy that. I just want to look at one way, I think, which is really interesting for using the mother tongue, is when you ask students to do a listening comprehension in English, and then you say, sort of pause, in pairs, what did you understand? Why don't, if you haven't tried it yet, try this. Try asking them to feed back in Spanish the first time. Because if you ask them to comprehend in English and then share in English, it's actually, and then perhaps tell the class in English, who is going to answer the questions, who is going to do the task? It's going to be the strongest speaker. It's going to be the one who's the best speaker, not necessarily the best listener. If you ask them to listen in English and then summarize, paraphrase, etc. in Spanish, at least the first time, then whilst you're monitoring the class, you can really find out who is the best listener and focus purely on the listening skill rather than mixing listening and speaking. It's a really interesting way of going about things. And you can do this with the other skills too. Just switching between languages is a really good way to isolate the target skill and to find out who really has understood and exactly what they have or haven't understood. One more thing is with a CLIL type class, it's what I like to do is that just if we're doing sort of save the world yet again, just begin by putting all the words on the screen if you're teaching online or on the board as they come into class. Begin with the cognates, all the cognates that are in the text or all the cognates they might need for the discussion. Ask the students to guess the pronunciation, and obviously they can find out the meaning of the words in brackets which are not cognates. And then add the word stress, and then I'll just change my glasses to make me slightly more interesting for you because you've been looking at my boring old face for a long time. And then pairs can celebrate or modify their guesses. And that's how you can deal with a CLIL class. And obviously, depending on the topic, you can put an awful lot of language up there to make it accessible to our students. You couldn't possibly do this with a multilingual class because you don't know what they know from their various languages. So my summary of cognates and so on, we use L1 knowledge all the time. So let's share and celebrate this strategy systematically. It should be, thank God you speak Spanish or Portuguese, not no Spanish, no Portuguese. You can't switch it off. Imagine how much harder this would be if you didn't. Aren't we lucky? Aren't we lucky? That's my attitude to Spanish and Portuguese. As I said, I think the universalist method is really holding students back, and they don't see the advantages they have. They don't see the potential for rapid progress it's just there if we just shape things and tailor things appropriately. Ours is not a general English situation. We teach ESP-SP, which is English to Spanish speakers, or ESP, the real meaning of ESP is English to speakers of Portuguese. And I think we have to customize and tailor our pedagogical choices to local reality. On we go. I'm really looking forward to your feedback on this. I do hope you agree with me. Let's look at pronunciation briefly. We've done a lot on vocabulary. This is when I started teaching monolingual groups of Spanish speakers in 1983 in Venezuela. And the first thing I did was consult sort of Michael Swan's book about learner English, if you remember that. And it said that for Spanish speakers, there are 37 items you need to focus on. And I tried. Then much more recently, that wonderful book, Teaching English Pronunciation for a Global World, which came out last year, they reduced it down to 11 items, but it's got better and better and better. Excuse me. Because if you look at the current research, the main initial consonant priorities for international intelligibility for our students are actually only 4. So the more specific, the more we go for international intelligibility, English as a lingua franca, knowing our students, instead of the 37 items, which in 1983 I tried to cover, we can actually now just focus on far fewer things. So if you think about the number of pronunciation activities which you've used across your life, which you think, why am I doing this? It's not particularly relevant. If we go for much more tailored, specific approaches, we can reduce the content down to a very few, but most useful items for our students. So it's a lighter, more efficient workload. Again, and it lets them see, and we can see that knowing their mother tongue is an asset, it's a resource. So many of the sounds in English exist in our students' mother tongues. And if you're looking to design an A1 pronunciation syllabus, I'm working on one at the moment. All of this I've included in some new material which I'm writing for A1. Look at, that's my pronunciation syllabus in terms of suffixes. You can cover all of that very easily at A1. Look at the words the students have access to, both to comprehend and, if you wish, they can try to produce them. So there's so much more we can do in terms of pronunciation by being more specific. And it's so much easier too when it's tailored to our students. A lot of time is saved. What's the most important teacher quality of all? Is it to be gorgeous and good looking? Is it to be bald and old like me? What do you think? According to the research, it is empathy, putting ourselves in the shoes and minds of our students. And we have all kinds of empathy. What we have best of all, I think, is linguistic empathy, especially at lower levels. When you look at talks on empathy, you get this type of advice you see there. Listen actively, withhold judgment. There's loads and loads of research and material available now to practice empathy, but rarely do we talk about linguistic empathy. And that's what we have, and it's our greatest asset in many, many ways. It makes you into a super teacher because you know what the students are thinking. You've been there yourself. You can, oh, sorry, I've just done something silly. Pressing the wrong buttons. There you go. Silly me. This is the attitude I think we need for teaching. I can help you learn more quickly because I'm Latino too. Not in my case, but at least I've studied and learned the languages my students speak. I had exactly the same problems you're having. You're an ideal model for your students. And if you tailor your linguistic empathy not only into yourself and your teaching, but also into the materials and syllabuses that you're using, I believe your students will benefit enormously. And I have to ask this question, are Latino students being held back for the wrong reasons? Interesting question. Many publishers produce country-specific or region-specific materials which incorporate the first language to some extent. If you go to Poland, there are all sorts of books for Polish students, 40 million students. If you go to Greece, I think it's about 18 million Greeks. All the books, there's loads and loads of books which are Greek-specific. What about Latin America? What you get perhaps more and more these days is what I call add-ons. You get this sort of extra book to help the students, but they're not a starting point. The syllabuses are not adapted. It's still the same international method, which is being exported as a global product rather than a specific product. So people are trying to shape things more, which is great. But the extras, the specifics for our students tend to be in the resource books or in the teachers' books. Now, do you have access to resource books? Do you have time to use teachers' book? Most teachers in Latin America, to my experience, are too busy rushing through the traffic from one job to another. And they don't have much time to prepare at all. And then they never get through the course book or the material. So adding on all the extras seems just to fall by the wayside. It should be the core of what we're doing rather than just an add-on. My belief is that 700 million Latinos deserve much better than much of the current diet which we're giving them. So again, I'm not trying to offend anybody or say anything negative. I'm just talking as a frustrated 67-year-old teacher. I'm trying to give back what I've learned by watching class after class after class. Let's see, and then let's look at grammar now. We've done pronunciation, we've done vocabulary. We're moving towards the end. You'll be pleased to hear. What's the best way to reduce translation errors? In my experience, it is to anticipate them. If you look at those mistakes, I can see the pain on your faces. I have 18 years, or I have my dog since 3 years. What I love to do is just put the errors up on the screen if you're teaching online, on the board at the beginning of the class. You can elicit the correction if the students know already, but the problem with eliciting the correction is it's always the same students who give you the answer. It's the Wikipedias. I know, every class has a Wikipedia, and it tends to be frustrating for the other students. If you put it on the board and say nothing at the beginning of the class, just show the mistakes, what's going to happen if you translate. The students don't need to speak a word of Spanish. They can work it out for themselves. And again, with multilingual classes, you can't do this because you can't anticipate the mistakes. You have to wait until they've made the mistakes and then start to correct them. But in our case, we can be much more proactive, and it speeds things up really well. It's a great pedagogical shortcut. Here's another example. If you just put that on the board and then correct it, home is the nicest place in the world, okay? And then you can ask contrast questions. Is the word order the same or different? How? How many words in English? How many words in Spanish, for example? How? Is the punctuation the same, etc.? Or is the meaning the same? Is the use the same? Is it similar or different? You can simply look at that framed. Of course, the students have mentally translated. They don't need to verbally translate. But by beginning with the issues which come from the inevitable, then you can speed things up enormously. It's much faster than sort of read through a long text and answer the questions. The typical inductive presentation. Now, read the text again. Again, teacher, really, teacher? Yes, please read the text again, and we're going to analyze the vocabulary. Okay, teacher, so they read it again, and they're beginning to hate the text. And then you say, now, I want you to read it a third time. Oh, teacher, no, anything but that. Please, 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 could you read it a third time? And now we're going to extract the grammar, which is exactly the same in Portuguese or Spanish. What's the point of taking such a long time, this huge inductive process, denying the inevitable? The students translated the grammar the first time they saw it. So rather than wait till the third time, it seems to me we can accelerate that process enormously. I'm really going off these long inductive presentations. Okay. It gives you a clear, efficient model and much more time for practice. And the most important thing which can happen in a class in many, many ways is practice. Our students need more practice. Again, my experience of observing classes from Chile up to Mexico is that there isn't enough practice. There's lots and lots of explanation, lots and lots of exercises, but just, fast, intensive practice is the best way to sort of get rid of errors and to deliver fluency and joy to a classroom. It's also a great way to flip too. If you just sort of ask the students to do the translation outside class, they could do it for themselves. You could give it to them like this, but asking students to translate examples or just look at examples, mistranslated, corrected, however you choose to do it, is a really good starting point for a flipping approach. So the method I would suggest is getting students to compare mentally. They don't need to verbalize Spanish. Notice any similarities and celebrate because it's similar. It's near to what I know. Hallelujah. Focus on any differences and then practice as much as you possibly can in English. And that's sort of, it's not a method, it's not a technique. It's simply, that's how I've been teaching for the last 30 years with monolingual groups. And it tends to help students get the idea more quickly. Here, perhaps, are a list of advantages of that sort of thing. And I often do this, just before I move on, I often do this when you've got a phrase, a sentence, a block of language in focus. Just say, okay, quickly look at it, translate it. Whisper your translation to your friend if you need to. Confirm together if you need to. But it can be silent. It can be mental. Just look, think, compare, count, notice, celebrate. Ooh, notice the problem. Okay, got the message? Now let's continue. Just giving them that process because it's going to happen anyway. They're looking for equivalence all the time. And that sort of pause, take a moment, have a little think, maybe compare if you wish, maybe whisper. So don't shout out translations. We don't want that. But I encourage my students to whisper together. Then that way you're bringing in the mother tongue. It's there anyway. You can't switch it off. Using it wisely, using it efficiently, and then making more space for practice time. The advantages of that, I'll give you a list here. There are many, many advantages of modeling the traps without using Spanish. It can accelerate comprehension. I'll just let you read these whilst I have a drink. Translation is often described as the best way to notice. To me, the most important critical thinking skill, I mean, again, it's one of the great 21st century skills, but to me, perhaps the most important critical thinking is actually critically thinking between your first language and your target language. Excuse me, it develops metalinguistic awareness, but also it's very satisfying when you find it simple. And it clarifies very quickly when you find it's different. And then I wanted to include him because poor Mario had just recently died. He was my guru, and he taught so many of us so many wonderful techniques. He said quite clearly, English grammar can be better understood by looking into the mother tongue grammar mirror. When do the students say, teacher, I understand. Ahora sí. When do they say that? When do they say that? Normally, you can explain and explain and explain. It's, okay, teacher, okay. It's normally when they've actually compared with the equivalent or found the equivalent or simply translated into their own language. And once they've done that ping pong process, they're happy again. And as Scott Thornberry says, the skill of translation is integral to being a proficient L2 user and contributes to overall plurilingualism. So it's utterly valid to practice translation, perhaps not so much in class, perhaps more outside class, but nevertheless, using mental translation, I think, is a great way forward. And obviously, the opposite is true too. If by denying contrast, it can frustrate, it can confuse, it can mislead. It's very negative. It can delay and it can decelerate learning. So it's often good to look at what if you don't do it, then you cause a lot of problems. Okay, one last technique for grammar, and then we'll round up because we're getting near the end. The oldest activity in the book, just giving students parallel texts and then asking them questions to find the answers. Great technique, but it's very rarely in our materials because they're so international. Compare examples. How do you say el café se hace con los granos, for example? They say it's made from the beans, etc., etc. So give them 6 phrases. They look for them. How do you say them? Via Spanish. They're speaking English, not Spanish. Spanish is written but not spoken. How does the form of the passive differ from Spanish? And immediately the students are able to start talking about language. It's incredibly efficient. It's very quick. And the room for doubt, I think, is greatly reduced. So at the beginning, sorry, there's a frog in my English throat. I asked you at the beginning to think of 2 items of clothing. Have you got lots now? I've got 13. I wonder how many you've got. There they are. Those are my 13. Perhaps you found more. You've probably got a better range of clothes than me. Okay. And then there are 20 I've got which don't have the same mother tongue. And if you're a Portuguese speaker, obviously it's actually the same numbers. You've got a different spelling for chaqueta and zapatos, but it comes out more or less the same. So it's not 50-50 cognates, but you've got quite a lot more cognates than perhaps you thought. What's interesting about this is when the students are doing this activity, blouse, pants, etc. What they're doing is ping-ponging in their head. They're drilling themselves. It's a great activity, asking students to open the fridge and find 10 items which have the same first letter in English or parts of the body. Which ones? Any lexical set which you introduce, ask students simply to sort of try and find some kind of connection, something similar between the two. All they're doing then is drilling and drilling themselves. Great activity before a test, for example, and students love it. And it doesn't cost a penny, and it doesn't require any preparation. And remarkably, your salary remains the same. Hallelujah. So here are some questions for any lexical set. A lot of our textbooks have picture dictionary pages which introduce 10, 12 words via pictures. Then ask the students just to process them. Looking at the pictures, cover the words. Which words have the same first letters, same prefix, suffix, etc. in English and in our language? The spelling, how many letters are the same, which are nearly the same, which are different, which are more different, which are less different, which have the same word stress, same number of syllables, which perhaps sound like or make you think of a word, an expression, a sentence, a phrase in our language. And then more extensive, if you're extending this, can you find other words which rhyme with those, other words with this spelling? Is the etymology similar? And all of these questions you can ask in English about words which the students see in English, and they're mentally ping-ponging between Spanish and English. And I insist you answer in English. So keep saying the English word. Don't say the word in Spanish or in Portuguese. So it's a form of drill, but it's a really interesting form of drill because you're looking for connections, looking for hooks, ways to help students feel progress more quickly. And if you're working with tenses or phrases, again, the same thing. Any tense, any phrase or expression, is it used, formed, or ordered similarly in our language? Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't, but that processing will help the students remember. And I think, again, it's a form of critical thinking, but it advances learning more quickly. And these are great elicitation prompts. When you're introducing something the first time, look at this word, ask these questions. How many of the first letters, how many letters are the same? The first two? Is the stress in the same place? Just asking students constantly to make that contrast. You can conduct the class entirely in English, but what you're doing is taking them back to base in an interesting and productive way. It's extra processing, it's improved noticing. That's quite a nice little phrase, isn't it? Extra processing leads to improved noticing. All right, I think that's me nearly done. So to summarize that section, encourage any potentially helpful links to L1. It's intended, and here are all the reasons. There are so many advantages. I like that expression. It enriches their learning diet. And it makes them see you as a very good teacher because you've thought it through from different angles from most of the materials that we've been using. And the best thing of all is you don't have to speak Spanish to use Spanish. You don't have to speak Portuguese to use Portuguese. All you're doing is building connections and making the students ping pong between the languages as they naturally do anyway. Okay, I'll finish there. And now we're going on to questions. I've put on the screen, it's very small, I apologize, but I've tried to put the 12 key points from this session on the screen just to prompt some questions. And I'll stop there. You can go through that, read that through, and if you'd like to ask any questions, hopefully that will trigger a few questions. Many thanks for all that you've had to put up with from me. I do hope it's useful. I do hope it chimes bells. I hope it's what many of you are doing. And I do hope you can see the advantages of not holding back our students, but actually helping them to accelerate towards L1 based second language learning for our Latino students. Thank you. Questions?